Hello, my name is Mike Sassi and I'm delighted to be able to join you at the Defence Medical Academy for this leadership lecture. I've been a journalist for more than 30 years. For 20 of those years I edited regional daily newspapers and their news websites. I'm now an honorary visiting professor at Nottingham Trent University, where one of several things I do in that role is produce a leadership podcast for the Nottingham Business School. However, this short lecture is about my own career as a leader and an editor, and I hope there's something in it that'll be helpful to you as you set out on your own leadership careers. So, as my accent tends to give away, I was born and brought up in Sunderland. From there, I moved on to university in Lancaster, then Sheffield. However, my journalism began as a trainee reporter at what was then known as the Derby Evening Telegraph, now the Derby Telegraph. I spent 4 very happy years in Derby, and during that time I gained my very first taste of leadership as news editor, managing a small team of reporters. From there I moved down to the daily newspaper in Exeter, the Express and Echo, and then to Cardiff at the daily South Wales Echo. My first editorship was at the Lincolnshire Echo in Lincoln. I was in charge of a lovely little operation, 50 journalists, £3 or £4 million budget, and I stayed there for almost 7 years. Then it was on to the Sentinel in Stoke-on-Trent, which was a very big and powerful daily newspaper at the time and a Sunday paper. More than 130 journalists in total, and lots and lots of print and online products. And then finally, another big news operation, the Nottingham Post and its Nottinghamshire Live website, where I was editor and publisher. And Nottingham is where I still live. It's my home. For the last 18 months, I've been director of a small city TV station, Notts TV, which has been established since 2015. While at the same time I've been lecturing in journalism at 2 universities, Nottingham Trent and Derby. I've also been doing work, as I mentioned earlier, at Nottingham Business School on leadership, and I'm a visiting honorary professor there. Now, one of the things I did in preparation for this lecture was listen to the excellent leadership presentation by your own Director General, Peter Homer. He started, I believe, with a quote from a Danish philosopher: "We live life forwards, but understand it backwards." And that's something that I really can identify with. If only I'd known at the start of my career what I know now. So during the next 26, 27 minutes, I'm going to give you 11 pieces of leadership learning that I wish someone had given to me when I was starting out on my career. I'm going to back these up with by name checking a number of the books, authors, experts who have helped and inspired me along the way. Hopefully they might do the same for you. So the first thing I wish I had known is that as soon as you decide you want to be a leader, start thinking like one. Now this might sound very obvious, but genuinely the sooner you start thinking about your leadership, the better prepared you will be. And wow, do you need to prepare? You cannot start soon enough. I'll never forget the occasion when, as a young journalist, a very well-respected editor took me aside and said that I should start aiming for editorship. It was such a good steer. It changed my mindset completely. In practical terms, it didn't make me behave too differently. But it did make me realise that I needed ideas. I needed to start thinking about the issues that might shape my leadership. So 25 years ago, as a young journalist, I started trying to work out why people were falling out of love with their local paper, which was a big issue in those days. I could see that every day. Local papers put smash bang wallop stories about murder or mayhem on their front pages. And we did this to generate impulse sales. People have a more immediate, more emotional reaction to bad news. It's well documented. The stories were accurate. So editors couldn't quite understand why readers complained that they didn't recognise the picture the local paper painted of their town or city. Of course, what editors had failed to realise was that the relentlessness of a paper's negative coverage meant that locals didn't recognise their home. Readers thought we weren't being truthful, or that we were writing about somewhere else. The reality was that our paper was packed with 100 accurate local news stories, but readers' perception was that these stories just weren't relevant for them. So while I was still a young reporter, I started talking about how local papers might change that perception, preparing for the day when I was in charge. Now, the whole idea about perception versus reality had come from my mentor, who was a much more experienced journalist and who I looked to for advice, guidance, friendship. And that gives me another good learning point. All leaders and would-be leaders need mentors to bounce ideas, point in the right direction, to help with their thinking. And it was my guidance from my mentor and the ideas, the things that I generated, that meant when I did become an editor, I was prepared. I was ready to put my ideas into practice. I wasn't caught in the headlights. I was ready to act. And once I did become an editor, I soon found that for me, I think for a lot of people, the most important leadership quality is the ability to build a good team. On reflection, I probably built a whole career on my ability to build a good team. Creating teams that are greater than the sum of their parts is such an important element of any leader's role. I've always surrounded myself with people who are, in terms of what they do on a day-to-day basis, better than me. They've been expert news editors, brilliant storytellers, excellent writers, and that's all great. But as important is that they've been an integral part of my jigsaw. Good leaders are always trying to put together a jigsaw. When you're constructing your team, the person who you select for each role should always have a good track record and an excellent skill set, but they must also fit into the environment that you're building, into the jigsaw that you're pulling together. Now, that doesn't mean that all your staff must be from the same background. Quite the contrary, as I'll point out in a moment. Diversity is also crucial for success. However, leadership is primarily about crafting a team that punches above its collective weight. In my experience, it's absolutely crucial. When I was editor of the Nottingham Post, the company I was working for, was taken over by a new owner who wanted our traditional newsprint newsroom to become a digital-first operation. Almost overnight, we had to move from publishing a daily newspaper every morning, 6 days a week, to start uploading local digital content 24 hours a day to our Nottinghamshire Live website. Now, I was responsible for implementing the change, including its implications for the 50 newsroom staff. It was a very big ask. Similar plans had caused all kinds of problems in other cities. However, within a month in Nottingham, we were able to create a new digital newsroom to localise the overarching company plan, generate a new online audience, and most importantly, certainly most importantly for me, win trust across the newsroom. And we were only able to do that and turn Nottingham into an exemplar for other regional newsrooms because we'd spent some time, months, years beforehand, establishing a high-performing leadership team. If we hadn't had the right people in the right positions, we would have struggled. So it's very important to remember that as a leader, your success will be determined by the performance of others. When I was a young editor, that was what gave me the biggest thrill. It was incredibly exciting to build and mould a dynamic team, as I saw it, to take on the world. And as I became a more experienced leader, it was equally, if not more thrilling, to see people that I'd taken on as trainees and junior staff go on to become editors themselves, and on at least on one memorable occasion to become my boss. I recently interviewed a former very senior banking executive by the name of Robin Fowle, and he was a senior banker at both Barclays and Santander, and he's now an inspirational leadership guru who I'd recommend to you unreservedly. He talked a lot about the thrill of being a leader, and he's dead right. So pulling together your leadership team is important, and when you're doing that, obviously enough, you need to rely on your own intuition. However, you must also make sure your decisions are based on facts. Take time to research your recruitment decisions thoroughly. In fact, take time to research all your decisions thoroughly. The most important thing I did during my 20 years as a frontline leader was take on staff. Up to a dozen journalists I took on in junior roles went on to be editors. Others became leaders elsewhere. I was always looking out for good staff. It's what I did. Because if you have the right staff, you can do anything. If you have the wrong staff, life is so much more difficult. So choose well. At one point, I worked for a man who said, always trust the editor's gut, at which point he would then slap his stomach hard. He meant, of course, we should trust his intuition. Now, he was a good editor, The stories his papers and websites published were invariably thorough and accurate, but his recruitment decisions were not always so well researched. I learned a lot from observing the occasions on which he intuitively made the wrong decision, because he didn't do his research and he didn't ask anyone else's opinion. I also spent months watching the rest of his staff deal with the consequences. If I had to commend one leadership book to you, this would be it. Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. Kahneman won a Nobel Prize for economics, but he wrote this book about what he calls intelligent gossip. It isn't meant to be about leadership, I don't think, but it's one of the best leadership manuals I've ever read. In the 1950s, he was a member of the Israeli Defense Forces, and he was tasked with setting up an interview system for every new member of the army. Now, I'm not going to tell you the story now. It's only a few pages of the book, but it talks about, as a leader, choosing staff, the importance of objective fact gathering. There's always a place for intuition, for the editor's good, but only after establishing the facts. Good leaders do not shoot from the hip. This book was first published in 2011, and since then, every time I've been interviewing staff, before speaking to anyone, I've reread it. So I remember not just to act on my own innate preferences. And here's another reason why it's important you don't always simply act on your gut instinct. This photograph was taken around 30 years ago. It was the newsroom football team at my first paper, the Derby Telegraph. There were young reporters on the team, including myself, back row, third from the right, as well as senior people, news editor, chief photographer, and both the editor and the deputy editor, who were actually in their own merit rather than just rank. It was tremendous fun at the Telegraph. Great place to work, great place to learn, and the standards of journalism were very, very high. Of the 15 people in this picture, 8 went on to become editors around the country, which was unusual for a single newsroom, never mind a football team. But as this photo suggests, at that time newspapers were very male-dominated institutions. So I was lucky that my next job was to work for one of only 2 women local newspaper editors in Britain at the time, at the daily paper in Exeter, the Express and Echo. It was a similarly enriching learning experience, and one which opened my eyes to the benefits of creating a more diverse environment. There were as many women as men on the management team in Exeter, and both newsroom and newspaper were clearly better for that. The news team was more representative of our audience. It was probably a more collaborative environment. Certainly decisions were more balanced, and I learned the leadership lesson. Different people see the world in different ways. So for the 20 years I was an editor, I was always trying to build diverse leadership teams. For example, when I was at the Nottingham Post, we were one of the very first local papers in Britain to appoint a woman as a frontline football correspondent covering Nottingham Forest. At that time, it was a radical move, but I didn't take her on just because she was a woman. She was a brilliant writer and a very good journalist. She was also passionate about her football, like the tens of thousands of other women football fans among our readers. Sarah was ideal for the job, and 7 years on, she's still doing a cracking job. Diversity is one of the things you have to be thinking about as a leader. The best leaders are constantly looking for diverse opinions to inform their decision making. In my experience, it makes their decisions more thorough and well-rounded, and their organisations more creative and innovative, which is equally true of this next piece of leadership learning. Cultivate collaborative relationships. Make friends. That is, relationships with people above you, among the people you answer to, alongside you, colleagues at the same level, but most importantly, among the people you lead. One of the great privileges of being a leader is the opportunity it gives you to talk to so many different people. I absolutely loved wandering around a newsroom, passing the time of day with people. In my experience, if you're in charge, most people will want to talk to you, particularly if you're friendly, receptive, willing to listen. I would always learn so much from simply walking and talking to the people, walking around, talking to the people who worked in my organisations. Now, obviously, this is difficult during lockdown, but finding time to talk to your staff at all levels about the things that are important to them, because that's crucial, even if the conversation's online, that's always going to be helpful. Talking to people helps you see your leadership through their eyes. There's a great line in the Harper Lee novel To Kill a Mockingbird, my favourite novel and a fantastic book for any leader who wants to know how to gain respect. The line is, you never understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb inside his skin and walk around in it. Now, if you read the book, you'll understand the context, but it is all about seeing the world through the eyes of the people you lead. If you're able to empathise with your colleagues, you'll find them so much more supportive, and as a result, your leadership will inevitably be more successful. And the same is true for relationships with people outside your organisation. When I arrived in Nottingham, the paper had very tricky relationships with many of the important players in the city, and it meant our business had suffered. So every week for the first 50 weeks of my editorship, yes, 50 weeks, I visited a different local organisation to explain who I was and what I was trying to do. It was a tough sell, but it built a lot of solid relationships, collaborations that were very helpful to the post. Building trust, because that's what it is, trust in your leadership is so important. Another important piece of learning, as a leader, you should never forget how much power you have. People are always looking to you from both inside and outside your organisation. As a leader, you set the tone. For much of my career, I would often wear a tie to the office. When I walked through the door in Nottingham, no one wore ties. I said nothing, didn't bother me in the slightest. But by the end of the week, I realised half the office was now wearing a tie. I thought it was funny, but it reminded me that when I start smiling, others tend to do that too. And if I laugh, when it's appropriate, as often I do, it encourages other people to laugh. One of the things a leader has to do is recognise quickly that he or she is a role model. In particular, if you're negative about something, then the chances are your staff will be negative about it too. Now, this is a very personal opinion, but I always see part of my role as a leader as being to balance out the innate negativity bias that is often baked into people. Now, I'm not suggesting leaders are just there to give people the good news. If you're a newspaper editor, then far from it. But you have to make sure that the people you are leading have a sense of perspective. As I mentioned earlier, most of us react more viscerally to bad news. We're more likely to read it, click on it, lap it up. If you're in any doubt, just look at social media. That in turn often leads us to believe things around us are a lot worse than they actually are. Now, this book explains that whole issue. It's called Factfulness, and it's by Hans Rosling, and it looks at people's instincts and why they do what they do. When I first read it, I wished it had been published 20 years earlier. It's another tremendous book and a great help for any future leader. At one point in my career, I took over from a very strong, dominant leader. He was well thought of in the industry, but when I met my new staff, they were all absolutely petrified. They seemed to be permanently frozen. In fact, the only time they did speak was to agree with everything I said, which wasn't necessarily a bad thing. However, they were just not used to thinking for themselves. And as a result, it was difficult for me to use their collective abilities to develop and to grow the business. It took me quite a while to sort out, and it made me realise the importance as a leader, particularly in my line of work where editors with huge personalities can become legends, of not being so dominant that the people who work for you simply acquiesce. Being frightened stops people from performing to the best of their ability. And leadership is all about getting the best out of people. So leaders need to instill confidence and not fear. And talking of fear, one thing leaders should never be frightened of is getting their hands dirty, of checking things out themselves rather than relying on the word of somebody else. One of the best definitions of what a good news reporter does, and one which I regularly passed on to my staff, is summed up in a story told by a Guardian journalist, Nick Davies, in his book Flat Earth. The story goes, two men went to mow a meadow. One comes back and says, job done. The other comes back and says, we haven't done a thing. We haven't cut a single blade of grass. Now, based on these facts, the lazy reporter will write a story which says, a dispute has arisen between two men about whether a meadow was cut. The good reporter goes back to the meadow and finds the truth. Now, I always extrapolated that story to my own editorship, to my own leadership. I'd frequently be faced by different people telling me different stories, and often the quickest way to establish the truth was just to check myself. So, for example, in the old days of newspapers, back in Lincoln, I would ask newsroom colleagues, why was today's newspaper printed late? Now, this was an important question that made a big difference to sales and revenue. But I'd get dozens of different replies. Late adverts, technical hitches, bad weather. So in the end, I started walking down to the printing press to find out myself. It was the best way of establishing the truth, and it shows why, as a leader, you shouldn't be afraid to get your hands dirty. And it's not dissimilar from the realization that as a leader, you have to be humble enough to admit when you're wrong and to learn from your mistakes. I spent 20 years on the Editors' Code Committee. Did I say 20 years? I meant 10 years on the Editors' Code Committee, the organisation that writes and revises the code enforced by the Independent Press Standards organisation, IPSO. Now, this meant that I spent a lot of time, too much time, reading complaints by or from readers of local and national newspapers. In my experience, most newspapers take complaints seriously and work hard to avoid them. But I've known editors and news editors and reporters who certainly believe the old maxim that if at first you don't succeed, you should destroy all evidence that you ever tried, which is stupid, which is foolish, because above anything, it undermined their credibility and their leadership credentials. The first lesson from any mistake is to hold up your hands, to try to rectify your error, then analyze what you did wrong, and to make sure it doesn't happen again. In leadership terms, it minimizes the impact, and in the long run, it enhances your credibility, because good leadership has to be underpinned by honesty, which means that leaders should also be humble enough to admit when they don't feel they have all the answers. If you don't know, don't pretend, you'll get rumbled. Leadership does not always mean choosing a specific route, then sticking to it. In my experience, the bravest thing may well be to be honest when you're not sure what's best, and say so, but say that you're working on it. If you look around you, some of the worst decisions that have been made by leaders during the pandemic have been because, at a time of profound uncertainty, they've just been too certain. Good leaders are considered, measured, and above all, humble enough to embrace uncertainty. That's true strength. But as a leader, you must also be fearless when you know you are right. So early in my career as an editor, my newspaper spent a couple of years writing about a council leader who we knew was fundamentally corrupt. At one point, the council he led bought a piece of land he owned for a vastly inflated sum of money without him telling anyone it was his land. It was a complex and controversial set of stories that inevitably ended up in court. The council leader was particularly well connected, and one evening, while I was sitting at home watching television, I had a call from the managing director of the parent company of my newspaper. Now, I'd never spoken to him previously, and I've never spoken to him since. But he said, "Evening, Mike. Just ringing you about this council business." Pause. "You are right, aren't you?" "We certainly are," I said. "Glad to hear it," he replied. And that was the end of the conversation. Now, I don't know why he rang, or what he thought I might or might not do. But the following week, the council leader was found guilty of corruption in public office and was sent to jail. And my newspaper was widely congratulated on having put him there. So if you're right, stick to your guns. That's not always easy. Leaders under pressure can feel very lonely. But that's another reason why you surround yourself with a supportive team. And here I name check one of my favourite books, Matthew Said's Rebel Ideas. Said is a fantastic storyteller, which is why I've consulted his books extensively during my leadership. He wrote the excellent Bounce and Black Box Thinking, which you may well have heard of. But the book I've used most recently is Rebel Ideas. I like it because it talks about how groups, teams, organisations become successful. And finally, my last piece of leadership advice. Very simple, embrace change. Change is one of the reasons you're in charge, because you are willing to take your organisation boldly into the future. It's what leaders do. Don't be nervous, grit your teeth. Even if society is going through a period of unprecedented uncertainty, as we obviously are at the moment, even if you think it might endanger your own position, you really shouldn't be bothered. The biggest issue I've ever had to deal with as a leader is, as I touched on earlier, the seismic shift from print or newspaper journalism to online publishing. Those news organisations that have survived, that will survive, are those that have embraced change. A leader's role is to provide clear direction towards well-defined goals that will bring his or her organisation future success. So this is a fantastic Greek proverb. It reads, "A society grows great when old men plant trees in whose shade they will never sit," which I think says it all. The best leaders are leaders who are truly selfless. They put the interests of their organisations before their own. So I hope this lecture has been helpful to you. I also hope you all enjoy long and successful leadership careers. As I mentioned earlier, I've recently recorded short interviews, around 20 minutes each, with a dozen prominent leaders, including banking executive Robin Fowle, who I quoted earlier, your own Director General Peter Homer, and Sir Ken Elisa, who must be one of the most interesting leaders in Britain. The interviews are part of the Nottingham Business School Business Leaders podcast series, and I commend them to you. Once again, thank you for listening, and good luck in your future leadership careers.